Thank you. We're excited to be here to do some readings from our book, The Emotional Journey of the Alzheimer's Family. We thought we'd start out and talk a little bit about how the book came about for us, why we wrote it, and what we feel sets the book apart, because there are many really good books on Alzheimer's disease and caregiving, and we think that there are some elements of this that are unique. So first, how this came about, Bob and I have been colleagues at Dartmouth working with dementia families and Alzheimer's families for several years, and we referred to one another and worked with each other quite a bit. And as we were doing that, I started to develop some interest in grief, particularly in unique expression of grief in dementia, which is in the book. And Bob was organizing conferences and coming up with some of his own clinical ideas about the dynamics of family members living with Alzheimer's. Bob had an offer of a publishing contract from University Press of New England, and at that point I had decided that I was going to write a book just on my own. So we sort of merged those two things, my interest in writing a book on dementia grief and his interest in writing a book on support groups, and it merged into this book. That's how it came about. We think that there are a few elements that are aspects of this book that are relatively unique, that set it apart. One is that this is really psychologically oriented, and by that I mean there's many really good books on caregiving and coping, and they're all very good. And they tend to be more about the social aspect, or from more of a social work perspective. Ours is more psychologically oriented, which means it's more about the inner dynamics and emotions and feelings and processes that people go through. We use a lot of stories. In fact, the stories from the people that we've worked with over the years are predominant, and we think that that's really special and something that we really like a lot about the book, and we've received some good feedback on so far. I mentioned the dementia grief. We position the unique experience of grief in dementia as the core emotional experience of people that are living with Alzheimer's or dementia in a loved one, and it's the center of the book. And then we also do a lot on the community resources, not just in a referral sense, such as you should go to a support group, but how to create an Alzheimer's community and why this is important and the psychological aspects of that type of support. So those are some of the elements in the book that we think really set it apart and make it a little bit unique. So Bob, do you want to start with your reading?
Okay. Thank you, Kesstan. Thank you, Kesstan, for giving that introduction, which is, I think, covers very well what led up to this. And we have a book. It's hard to decide what to pick from the book and talk about and what to cover in an hour. And I could go into some of the reasons why we selected the things we did, but the first part I'm going to read about comes from early in the book, where I talk about coping with discordant views of the illnesses, chapter 1, actually. And this is, actually, we're just working on this today, it's research that I'm doing. This is an area that essentially has to do with the person who has dementia or significant memory problems generally doesn't tend to recognize the illness or doesn't recognize the extent of it, whereas the family typically has a somewhat more realistic view. So there's a discordance there, there's a difference in how they view it. And we've seen over and over and over and over again in the clinic how much tension that difference creates, how much stress that creates for the caregiver and also for the individual with memory problems. And surprisingly, how little has been written about that subject. So I've been interested in that for a while and wanted to include that in this book. So I'm going to pick from that chapter on that and read a little bit about this. In the majority of people with Alzheimer's disease, the individual with the disease is less aware of the illness, its severity, and its consequences than are members of the family. While there are exceptions to this pattern, there is commonly a significant discordance between the person with the disease and the family member regarding the presence or extent of Alzheimer's disease. This still working without the pulled it back so it's feedback. Good. The gulf that so often exists between the family's view on the one hand and the view of the person with the disease on the other is one of the most distressing and difficult aspects of the family's attempt to cope with this illness, particularly in the early stages. Several elements contribute to this discordance. One is simply the memory impairment itself, which is, of course, a hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. The person with Alzheimer's often cannot recall previous events related to his or her cognitive difficulties. As family members would often say to me, he forgets that he forgets. Patricia had been suffering from Alzheimer's disease for about 5 years. Actually, I'm going to skip over that in the interest of moving along here. So one factor related to discordance is simple forgetting. A second factor is the use of the defense of denial by the person with Alzheimer's disease. This is a common defense mechanism we all use to some degree or others. Denial is a process that involves the active rejection from consciousness of a painful or frightening reality. People with Alzheimer's commonly use denial to avoid some of the more emotionally painful and frightening elements of their disease. So do their family members, and we talk about that in the book, but I'm not going to read about that here. The discordance between the views of the person with Alzheimer's and the family is often attributed to denial exclusively. You hear this, oh, he's in denial. And that is part of it, but the process is more complex, including forgetfulness and several other factors. A third factor that leads to discordance between how the family and the afflicted individual view the illness is a phenomenon neurologists call anosognosia. Now, anosognosia is a neurological term that refers to simple inability to recognize deficits because of some form of brain damage. And this can occur not only in Alzheimer's, although it's very common there, but in strokes and other neurologic diseases where the damage to the brain takes away the ability to actually see what's going on. And a fourth factor that contributes to the discordance of views is the stigma that is frequently felt about Alzheimer's disease and the consequent fear of social disapproval that is often experienced by its victims. Unfortunately, this stigma continues despite important improvements in care that have developed over the past decades, and despite the fact that increasing numbers of prominent figures, beginning with Ronald Reagan, have publicly discussed their own Alzheimer's disease. And more frequently one reads about this in the paper. Who was it just today? Omar Sharif, who reportedly has Alzheimer's disease. These are terrible things, but I think that it helps, and it's very brave of individuals and their families, I believe, to go out publicly and talk about this, and it helps bringing it out of the shadows to some degree. How do family members typically respond to the person with Alzheimer's who does not see his or her illness realistically? Some family members might argue with the person, insisting that he or she does indeed have a problem and they really need to see it and accept it. This approach is rarely helpful. If you've ever tried it, you probably know that. The person with the disease will likely become more defensive, and often both parties will end up feeling angry. Simple insistence does not reduce discordance or denial or any other of its elements. On the other hand, completely avoiding talking about the discordance creates a widening gulf between the family member and the person with the disease. Particularly when the family member is a spouse, there probably has never been an issue in their relationship that has been so fundamentally important, and where opinions are so fundamentally in disagreement. This disagreement is often greater than differences couples may have had about other basic subjects such as religion, politics, or sex. The emotional strain caused by this discordance is a major source of stress and unhappiness for family members. Both the family member and the person with the disease can understandably become quite upset by the tension and arguing that discordance creates. Family members who avoid any discussion of this discordance will usually give several reasons for this. Understandably, they don't wish to cause conflict with the loved one and worry that if they bring up the issue, it will likely lead to defensiveness and arguing or worse. In addition, they don't want to raise an issue they feel will diminish their dignity. And certainly they don't wish to cause distress to their loved one, as they're quite aware that living with the disease is already quite frustrating and painful for the person with the disease in the first place. In addition, some family members believe that telling the person with the disease that he or she has Alzheimer's will somehow cause them harm. The family may fear that the person will become so despondent over this news that they'll give up trying to function or will become even suicidal. However, studies that have examined the effect of disclosing the diagnosis have not found any harmful effects from this, even if, understandably, it is upsetting, at least initially. In fact, the person with Alzheimer's disease often becomes less upset with the diagnosis than family members do. This may be because the person with the disease suspects it, or because he may have already lost the ability to be concerned about the full implications of this illness. Nevertheless, families often assume that the news will devastate the person with the disease as it has devastated them, but this is usually not the case. It's important to remember that it is the disease that is devastating and not simply labeling it. However, for all of the reasons outlined above, there often exists this conspiracy of silence in which both the person with the disease and the family member are very aware that something is wrong, but neither wants to bring it up for fear of upsetting the other. Now, I'm going to close with a case example of that happened quite a few years ago. It goes without saying that we have, while these are real cases, we've disguised them, because in the Upper Valley everybody knows everybody, but you're not going to figure out who these people are. Mark and Joanna Kesstan, but because we've shared patients, but Mark and Joanna went for Mark's initial memory clinic evaluation, accompanied by their daughters Abigail and Bridget. Joanna had initiated the evaluation because of her concerns about Mark's increasing forgetfulness. However, she said to Mark that the evaluation was for the purpose of checking his stress levels, since he seemed more, quote, tense recently. However, Mark viewed the questionnaire that had been sent to Joanna to complete prior to the appointment and easily surmised that the real reason for the evaluation was his growing cognitive difficulties, about which he was quite aware. However, he never mentioned, here's part of the silence that I talked about, this conspiracy. However, he never mentioned to his wife that he'd seen the questionnaire prior to the appointment. It was just sitting on a table or whatever. He looked at it and just left it there. Shortly before his scheduled clinic visit, the physician received a telephone call from Joanna. That's me, I'm the physician. She asked that, quote, if he has Alzheimer's, don't tell him, it will kill him. On the day of the appointment, the doctor greeted the family in the waiting room and asked them to follow him to the office. My office, I'm retired now, so I don't have an office anymore, but my office used to be about as far as you can get from the waiting room. It was a very long walk, although right next to the bathroom, which had a certain advantage. But it was very interesting to watch how people would walk to the office. On the walk from the waiting room to the office, Mark pulled the doctor aside and whispered, if I have Alzheimer's, don't tell my family, they'll be devastated. So I think I'll stop at that point. Without reading it, I'll just mention that resolved by, we were able to talk about it in the meeting. The daughters helped with that because they said, what's going on? And I think it was helpful for all concerned. And nobody was damaged. Indeed, I believe people were helped by putting a label on what was going on. We didn't create it. We just simply gave it a label.
So should we just go back and forth and then do questions at the end?
Yeah, let's see our time. We want to be done by 8, so it's 7:20. Yeah, and then at the end we'll take questions about anything.
So I had mentioned a few minutes ago that an element of this book that we think is a little different, or that we know is a little different, is our coverage of our discussions of dementia grief. We consider grief the core experience of the emotional journey or experience of living with Alzheimer's and dementias. And I want to talk about that a little bit, and also the main experience of ambiguous loss within Alzheimer's disease. So first, let me just say that dementia grief is a unique experience of grief. It covers all of the loss in Alzheimer's, and I think Alzheimer's, there's so many losses. Tangible, subtle, psychological, future-oriented, past-oriented. There's really a very wide and deep range of losses. And it's really marked. It's really marked by this grief response. And within dementia, and Alzheimer's in particular, as you know, there's a central loss of the person that is profound and takes a long time, typically, and is also subtle and hard to manage. So that's really what makes the grief experience quite unique, is that central experience. So I'm going to read here a little bit about ambiguous loss, which I understand living with Alzheimer's disease to be characterized by ambiguity. That there's just a great deal of unresolved, unclear losses and changes that are not final. And that ambiguity is particularly difficult for most people to deal with emotionally, particularly over an extended period of time. So that's really what characterizes dementia grief. So I'm going to read a little bit about ambiguous loss, what it is, and then I'm going to read two small stories from the book that really capture the nuance of the different types of ambiguous loss that families can experience. Ambiguous loss is a term coined by psychologist Pauline Boss to refer to an interpersonal loss that does not have a normal sense of closure. According to Boss, there are two types of ambiguous loss. In the first, the individual is physically absent but remains psychologically present. This has been described as leaving without saying goodbye. Examples include prisoners of war or those missing in action, victims of disasters such as September 11th or the Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, or even the absence of a parent as a result of divorce. In the second type of ambiguous loss, the individual remains physically present but is psychologically absent, or as Boss has described it, the goodbye without leaving. This type of ambiguous loss occurs in a variety of conditions, and prominently in Alzheimer's disease. It is very difficult for the loved one to grieve for someone who may no longer be psychologically present as a spouse, a parent, a companion, or other intimate, but who remains very much present physically, with ever-increasing needs for care that must be met. The very ambiguity of the relationship makes it challenging for the family member to acknowledge the loss, grieve, and move forward. Since the person with the disease usually changes so gradually, it is not possible for the family member to determine a specific point at which the loved one ceased to exist as he once was. Ambiguous loss, a loss that resists resolution and complicates the grieving process, is the result. So I'm going to read two small stories from a type of loss that we call loss of the hope for reconciliation. This doesn't happen for everybody, but in the families that I've worked with, and I think Bob would say the same with his families, the families that I've worked with, that this type of loss became apparent, it's particularly profound to me. It's subtle, but it's a profound loss. And this is the type of loss that you don't know that you had a hope for reconciliation of, say, a difficult or an unresolved issue or relationship until you're realizing that it's too late to have that. So, Clara, an only child, was the primary care partner for her elderly mother, Roxanne, who suffered from dementia. Clara believed her mother had never wanted her or loved her. As Roxanne's dementia advanced, she became increasingly agitated by Clara's attempts to help her. At times, Roxanne expressed open animosity and even physical aggression. Clara obtained help from others, but she remained Roxanne's primary care partner. When asked to explain her willingness to care for her mother despite Roxanne's extreme behavior, Clara responded that all she had ever wanted was for her mother to affirm that she was a good daughter and that she loved her. Now that she has dementia, she said, "I'm afraid I will never hear that." And indeed, she did not. And then another, David had been emotionally controlling, dominating, and sometimes an abusive husband to his wife Susan, which led to a deeply ingrained pattern of treating one another with animosity and blame. David's Alzheimer's diagnosis did not change this pattern. Susan stayed angry and believed David was responsible for the changes in his personality and behavior. When it was brought to her attention that David had a brain disease that caused him to act in ways that were irrational or impulsive, she replied that he had always been a difficult person. When it was suggested she tried to accept the reality of the disease and make her husband feel as safe and peaceful as possible, she was stunned. "But he has always been mean," she asserted weakly. So she didn't know until we really started work through this that she was waiting for some level of vindication of her suffering from him, and that it was too late. That was never, and it may not have ever was going to come about anyway, but it certainly wasn't going to now. And so you can see that these are really nuanced types of losses, but they have a big impact on people's lives, and they need to be resolved in their own right.
They're psychological losses. They may be nuanced. They may be subtle from the outside, but profound inside. And that again, as you said earlier, that's the kind of focus that we were wanting to have. So should I go on the next one? Okay. Before I do, I want to just, this is the book, and I wanted to make a comment about the cover. For those, we also have hardback versions, which for some reason they didn't put a cover on it, which I don't know why they didn't put like a dust jacket, but the paperback, which is much cheaper, is what's here. And the cover, this is a painting drawn by a student that I work with at Dartmouth. I asked her to do this, commissioned it, for a very, very talented young woman who's an art major, who's working with me in a program that we have, and I'm going to refer to this actually at the Looking at Art at Dartmouth for people with Alzheimer's. And she's helped me create this program. We're working on continuing to work on that. Anyway, the cover represents a triptych. If you look at it, there's a young woman, a middle-aged woman, and an older woman who are combined into this one visage here. Whether it's 3 generations of a family or one person over time, ambiguous. And but I think it was very effective. It was just what we wanted, and I'm very proud that this young woman who was 19 at the time she did this was able to create this cover for us. So anyway, there's a lot we're skipping here. You've got to buy the book to be able to fill it in. Is that okay to advertise like that? I guess. And a lot of what I'm skipping to now is a section, again, that I think, Kesstan referred to this earlier on, that has to do with what we believe is a very, very important element of care for the individual who has the disease and for his family, which is what we call connecting with the Alzheimer's community. And this involves a number of different things, including the kinds of programs I mentioned, which we've created at Dartmouth. And there are some flyers out over by the cashier on the way out. You can pick those up about an activity we started here about 5 years ago called Memory Cafe. This other program that I'm doing with Allison and a couple others called Perspectives, where we have been bringing people into galleries at Dartmouth, people with Alzheimer's and their families, to look at our works, to talk about them, to have lunch with us and with students that are working with us together, as well as support groups. And all of these are ways of connecting with the community, and that's what I'm going to talk about and why we think that's important. in order, this is chapter 7, connecting with the Alzheimer's community, in order to achieve acceptance and to move forward with one's life, it is essential for the family care partner to reach out to the Alzheimer's community. What is the Alzheimer's community? Wherever there are people with Alzheimer's disease, there is an Alzheimer's community. The community consists of those who have the disease, their family members and other care partners, the professionals who are involved in their care. Nevertheless, this community often remains hidden for a variety of reasons. The reasons include the stigma surrounding the disease. Nobody wants to announce that they're a member of this club, particularly. As well as the fact that until you have reason to be involved, you wouldn't necessarily know about meetings that are going on and things that are going on for people with Alzheimer's disease. But we happen to think it's very important to become involved once you do have to deal with that. However, making a connection to this Alzheimer's community has great value, as I said before, to both the family member and the person with Alzheimer's disease. Let me just make another aside. We keep talking about Alzheimer's disease. The book refers to the Alzheimer's family. You could argue that the book should really be called everywhere we say Alzheimer's, we say dementia. Alzheimer's is a type of dementia. It's the most common form of dementia. By itself or in combination with other illnesses, it may account for up to 80% of all cases of dementia. So Alzheimer's is very, very common, but it is not the only cause of dementia. And there are differences, of course, between one dementia and the next, but there are more similarities than there are differences, perhaps, at least from the caregiver's perspective. So that everything we say about Alzheimer's, and I guess we know the most about that because we have encountered it the most often among these dementias, but everything we say, I think, applies pretty much as well to non-Alzheimer dementias. We got asked a question about this, remember, over at the hospital. We were doing we were doing a talk about this with that film, and so we said, well, what about the non-Alzheimer dementias? This person was caring for someone with frontotemporal dementia, and that one, in fact, is more different than others, but there are many, many similarities. And the need for the kinds of support, the kinds of intervention that we're talking about, I think cuts across the various different dementias. So that's just a bit of an aside and an explanation for why in some places we may use the word dementia, but mostly we use the word Alzheimer's. But we really could be talking about, we could be using either term. Making a connection to this Alzheimer's community has great value to both the family member and the person with the disease. It's an essential step moving forward from the anguish of grief toward the state of equanimity and acceptance. One of the most common and valuable entry points into the Alzheimer's community is the Alzheimer's support group. The great importance of support groups is not often fully appreciated, and support groups are generally woefully underattended. I don't run them anymore. I ran them for many years. I retired and I don't anymore, but I still have some teaching activities I do at the college, and I have students go, including one today. And so there was 7 people at the group, and that was not a bad sized group, the Aging Center. It was a smallish one, but it was not terrible. But we figured there are probably at least 2,000 people in the Upper Valley with Alzheimer's, and the average situation, at least according to the Alzheimer's Association, about 3 family members are deeply involved on average. It could be less, could be many more. So there could have been 6,000 to 8,000 people in that room. It's probably a good thing there weren't, but just trying to illustrate how frequently these groups are utilized, and how, one of the many terrible things about Alzheimer's is extraordinarily expensive illness. This is a treatment for Alzheimer's that's free. That's free. And it's one of the best things there is to help the person with Alzheimer's indirectly by helping the caregiver, but it's a very it's indirect, but it's almost direct, the assistance. There are several reasons why family member support groups are so valuable. One has to do with the opportunity to learn about the disease, including the common symptoms and behaviors, and to gain information about how to understand and manage these symptoms from others who are coping with it on a regular basis. Support groups offer an abundance of helpful, practical tips and tools for dealing with Alzheimer's. A second reason why going to a family member support group is so important lies in the interpersonal realm. Caring for a loved one with Alzheimer's disease is a unique experience. Only someone who has cared for a loved one with the disease can completely understand what is involved on a daily basis. And I would argue even with your very, very good friends who know you well, if they have had the good fortune not to have to deal with this disease personally, as much as they love you and as much as they know you, they don't quite understand it in the same way as somebody who's going through it. I'm going to skip over a lot, and there's a lot in here about support groups, and actually, as Kesstan mentioned, we were going to, the book I was going to write was about support groups, and it would still have been an interesting topic, but this book was a better one, but I am just a very strong proponent of support groups in terms of the value. If, as I said this, one of these meetings that we had, if the day comes along when we have a pill for Alzheimer's, you get Alzheimer's, here's your pill, take the pill, a week later you don't have Alzheimer's, we don't need any support groups. Forget it, throw them all out the window. But until that day comes, and I'm afraid that day is a very long way off if it ever is going to be here, we desperately need these as a very important part of care. So there's a lot I could say about support groups, but what I want to mention is other activities. There's great value in certain activities that family members can pursue with the person who has the illness. Of course, almost any activity shared by a family member and his or her loved one with Alzheimer's is valuable, particularly if the activity is enjoyable for both. It's critical for family members and disease victims alike to realize that they can still enjoy doing things together, even in the face of the illness, and even if the activity is not likely to be recalled shortly afterwards. Now let me just read an example of that. Sophie and Morgan lived together in a retirement community. Morgan had suffered from Alzheimer's disease for several years and relied increasingly on Sophie for assistance of all kinds. Although he was very kind to her, he showed little awareness of all that Sophie was doing to assist him. He verbally acknowledged that he had Alzheimer's disease, although he didn't really seem to have full awareness of the implications of that, despite his high intelligence and education. The retirement community was located on the shore of a lovely, quiet pond, and the facility had a number of pedal boats available for community members to use. I don't know how their lawyers allowed them to do that, but nevertheless. One day, Sophie packed a picnic lunch, and she and Morgan went out on one of the boats. They had a very pleasurable hour or so pedaling quietly around the pond near the shoreline, letting the boat drift while they ate their lunch and enjoying the fine weather before they pedaled back to shore. They enjoyed themselves greatly, even though Morgan had difficulty with the pedaling. He didn't seem to really understand how to do it. Just one day later, at dinner with the Whites, another couple from the retirement community, Mr. White described how they had spent the afternoon out on the lake in one of the pedal boats. Morgan listened attentively to the story, then turned to his wife and asked, "Why don't we ever do anything like that?" Sophie was tempted to remind Morgan that they had done that very thing one day earlier, but quickly realized that the comment would serve no purpose other than to embarrass him if he then remembered, or start a disagreement if he didn't. Instead, Sophie simply said, "Well, that's a great idea. We'll definitely do that." So, again, emphasize, the importance is in the activity in the moment. Poor Morgan had no recollection even the next day that they had done this, and complained they never did anything fun like that. People hear that sort of thing from their loved ones all the time, and it's understandably very frustrating for the caregiver to hear that. I mean, I went to all this trouble to make all these plans, and a day later it's like it's gone. People will talk about, and this is part of the grief, they used to love to do things like go to the movies with their loved one. They go to the movies, they come out of the movie, and they talk about it. Now they go to the movies, they come out of the movie, and by the time they're out on the street, the person who has Alzheimer's doesn't remember what the movie was. They can't talk about it anymore. The pleasure has to be in the moment, and one has to accept that. We all strive to live in the moment. That's a sort of a mantra that is supposed to be. People with Alzheimer's have achieved that. They have no choice. They can't live in the future, and they certainly don't live in the past. But you have to accept that as a care partner, and to take pleasure in the fact that it's in the moment, even if it's very much gone the next day. And that's, of course, that's part of the grief that we talked about, but part of the acceptance of that is to be able to say, yeah, we'll do that. We'll do that.
Talking about being in the moment is a good segue into what I want to close the reading with, which is about acceptance and what that means. But just to talk a moment about being in the moment. At the Aging Resource Center, myself, with Alzheimer's family members and some of my colleagues, with just people in general, we do classes on mindfulness. And mindfulness is a really important intervention that we use because of this. It really helps to learn to cultivate, to be very present to your loved one with Alzheimer's. It can help the communication, it can help the emotional engagement and relationship, and just help the person, the family member, cope with the stress of living with Alzheimer's in a loved one. So I want to talk a little bit about the difference between adapting and acceptance. So in the book, we delineate 3 stages. I said that word wrong in our last reading, and he corrected me in front of everybody. So I just want
I'll never do that again.
I bet you won't.
You won't need to on that word. I'll get that word right.
Well, there's another reason I won't need to, but I'll mention later.
So we distinguish 3 stages of anguish, adaptation, and acceptance. I think anguish speaks for itself. Adaptation is really about a behavioral or cognitive adaptation or change in response to the changes that are happening, the losses that are happening. And acceptance is not adaptation. You can adapt to the changes, into the losses, into the reality of the disease without accepting it, with still having a psychological or emotional resistance to it. So acceptance is a psychological state, and it's really about being present and accepting it for what it is in the moment. It doesn't mean you like it. It doesn't mean that it's a positive experience, although it often can be. And it's transient. So acceptance isn't achieved once and then you don't have to do it again. It's something that you access, and you have different, you move through different levels and depths of acceptance. I do think that once you learn to access it in a situation and living with a situation, you get better at that. But it's still something that comes and goes. So I'm going to close the reading portion here by, I'm going to read 4 small stories that I feel really demonstrate acceptance. 2 of them are more positive or funny, and 2 are more just poignant. So the first is Mindy was visiting her mother Blanche, who suffered from moderate stage Alzheimer's. The 2 were enjoying lunch on the patio of Blanche's house. Blanche observed that she had not called her friend Lorraine in quite some time. Mindy knew Lorraine had been dead for many years. She took a breath and responded lightly, "Mom, Lorraine died 10 years ago." "Oh," said Blanche. "I guess that's why I haven't called her." Mildred was a 92-year-old woman with moderate dementia. One day, as her daughter Geraldine sat with her, Mildred began to wonder aloud where her husband was. Geraldine became anxious because her father had died 14 years earlier. Having read that the appropriate response when a person with dementia does not remember the death of a loved one is to redirect them into other memories or conversations so as not to confuse or hurt them, Geraldine attempted to do this. But Mildred would not be redirected and began to work herself into anger as she recalled that her husband always had seemed interested in Patsy, a neighbor whose husband died some years ago and who was, her husband's neighbor years ago. Mildred came to believe that he was probably out of the house having an affair with Patsy. Geraldine's anxiety escalated, and she finally exclaimed, "No, Mom, Dad's not having an affair with Patsy. Dad died 14 years ago." Mildred was quiet for a moment before replying, "Well, that doesn't bother me as much." That's a true story. Yeah, it's a good story. So these last two are really touching to me because they're both scenarios of a person with Alzheimer's having a sudden lucid moment, and that the family member connected with them in that lucid moment. And I've been asked several times, and I'm sure you have too, by family members over the years, of, are those true? Do those happen? Because you read about them in books or see them in movies. And they do. And I actually had one, and I can talk about that but with my grandmother. But they do happen, but they're spontaneous. Not everybody has them, or perhaps they do, and just some people have them when no one else is there. But these last two stories are about moments like that. Lon's dad, Dan, was his hero. Growing up, Lon had idolized Dan, an energetic outdoorsman with many friends. Alzheimer's took that person away from Lon. As the disease progressed, Dan became agitated and aggressive. He started physical fights with Lon, sometimes around the pool table. Father and son circled the table slowly, as Lon refused to fight his dad and told him so. Even though you know it's not personal, that he didn't really mean it, it still really hurts, Lon acknowledged. At the height of Dan's agitation, the family had to call an ambulance and have him admitted to the hospital. The doctors felt they could manage Dan with medications, but when the family arrived at the hospital, he had been physically restrained because his aggression could not be contained. For 2 weeks, no one could subdue him. Gradually, with increasing medications and other interventions, the situation improved. The day Dan came home, he was disoriented and confused, flickering in and out of awareness, even in Lon's presence. They sat on the couch together. Lon talked with Dan, who stared off into space, but suddenly Dan came too, and Lon felt he had his dad again at that moment. Dan told Lon that he was unable to control himself or his feelings. He apologized to Lon. Lon told his dad not to worry about it, and that he loved him and he missed him. Lon said, "I kind of said my goodbyes to him then. I did not think it would be, but that was the last conversation I ever had with my dad." That's very touching, yeah. And in those moments, in those lucid moments, the person with Alzheimer's seems to really grasp what's happening to them. Lon said his father, said, "I know that I'm out of control. I know that I'm doing these strange things. I'm sorry. I can't help it." And that's particularly touching, I think. So the last one here. One cold winter morning, Irene tended to her grandmother in the kitchen. Irene's mother and sister chatted at the stove while they cooked eggs, and Irene stood at the toaster. "I felt my grandmother staring at me, and I turned around," Irene said. Her pale blue eyes were especially alert and intense, and seemed to express her awareness of everything happening to her. That intensity was unusual for her. My grandmother said, "You feel for me, don't you?" Irene nodded her head. "I can feel it," she said. Irene recalled, "We smiled at each other. The toast popped up, and I turned around. My mother and sister had not heard us. When we all sat down at the table for breakfast, the fierce presence in my grandmother's eyes from just a moment ago had faded away." So I'll tell you, that's the story of me with my grandmother. And she was very lucid in that moment, and she understood what I was doing for her. I was her primary caregiver. This is some years ago. And it was one of the more special moments of my life, that I knew before she passed that she knew how much I cared for her and what I was doing for her. But we never had a moment like that again. After that, she lived for many years. So very, very touching moments happen and funny moments happen in living with the disease.
That certainly is true, and what makes one of the joys of caring for people for many years, at least in my case, with a disease that you can't cure, that just gets worse and worse and worse, sadly, and very frustratingly, but still nevertheless seeing these touching moments, these funny moments, and seeing the wonderful strengths of families coming together has certainly made this, which isn't what always happens, but does happen a lot of the time, certainly makes it very rewarding indeed. And to feel that in doing some of the things that we've talked about, being able to be helpful to people, again, not curing the disease gets worse and goes on. And one day maybe we'll have a treatment for it that's better than what we have now, but we're a long way from that, I think. So I guess we'll take some questions. Before we do, though, I'll never correct your pronunciation again. The main reason for that is because no sooner do we finish this, can I tell them this? Where are you going?
Oh, yes, yeah.
No sooner do we finish this book and with this wonderful experience we had working together on this and writing this, Kesstan announces she's moving to Florida. Next couple of weeks.
3 weeks.
3 weeks.
Oh.
She's taking a job down in Gainesville, Florida, and talk about grief. We're going to be missing you very much. Not Alzheimer's grief in this case, but a very real form of grief. So, because it's a unique experience writing a book with somebody. It's a great pleasure if it works well, and I think it did, and grew in my respect and affection for her, and hopefully that was true, at least until I corrected her in front of everybody last week or whatever it was. Yeah. So why don't we have 10 minutes or so? Let's just take questions. Yes.
Your book and your talk and everything is so very personal, and you're very intelligent people, and you deal with in a community of intelligent people. Can Alzheimer's come upon or to anybody? Can it be something that in a sense you would not have thought that Joe might have had this or Susie might have it, but indeed it does come to anybody? There is not, in a sense, a logic to this?
Yes, that's absolutely the case. It happens, it hits everybody. It doesn't spare people who are very intelligent or people who are very rich. It happens maybe a little less frequently in people who are very well educated, although I think that's confusing, and I'm not certain I agree with that finding, because I think if we don't have a test for this disease, we make it on the basis of examining someone and asking them questions. And people who are very bright and have a lot of education are good at taking tests. So I think they may not show their disease as quickly as somebody who's less well educated. I'm not sure the disease really discriminates at all in regard to that. It's an equal opportunity disease in that regard. There are lifestyle factors for sure. Do you want to talk about?
So the vast majority of cases of Alzheimer's disease occur in the population of 65 and older. So the main criteria is that you're aging. That's really the main criteria. Although there are lifestyle factors that do influence your risk factor for the disease, and a lot, they're the 7 modifiable, and I think they're physical inactivity, so exercise, a heart-healthy diet, managing diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol, any kind of heart condition, depression. So these types of things that you can do something about. It doesn't mean you won't get Alzheimer's. It does mean that you'll reduce your risk for developing Alzheimer's. The same as with many other diseases. These are the same modifiable risk factors for many cancers and other types of health conditions. So that can make a difference. It does visit people more often that have, you know, certain health conditions as well.
A few years ago, I was told that by a neurologist that the inheritance of the disease was unknown. That was probably 20 years ago. What would you say that information, that the answer would be now?
Well, we still don't understand the exact mechanics of the inheritance, but we do know overall that if you have a blood relative, a first-degree relative with the disease, a parent or a sibling, you definitely have a higher risk statistically of getting the disease. Now, statistics are funny things because, you know, if you look at a large population, statistics are very meaningful. In any one person, it's 100% or 0%, though. You either get the disease or you don't. So it's hard to know how to apply a statistic to a given person. But we do know that it runs in families. We know that one genetic factor that is probably more important than any other, but is not determinative, it's just a risk factor, is something called an apolipoprotein E gene that everyone has, and there comes in 3 forms. And if you happen to have the E4 variety in one of your genes, or if you have 2 of them, you get one from each parent, then you have definitely a higher risk, but it's not 100% risk. And so we don't understand yet all of the genetic factors. I think that's a very promising area for future study. We're learning a lot about genetics now that we know how to sequence the genome. There's a lot of information that's being gained, at least in diagnosis and understanding things like risk factors. What role it's going to play ultimately in treatment, or more importantly prevention, remains to be seen. Those are not steps that are right around the corner, unfortunately. But does that answer your question?
Question. Is there any biological testing that is reliable on early onset of Alzheimer's?
Well, yeah, there are tests. Now, when you say early onset, I assume you're not talking about young onset, people under 65, where you're talking about just early in the disease process.
Yes, exactly.
There is still no definitive test that proof positive says you've got Alzheimer's or you don't, or you're going to get it or you don't. We may, again, be moving closer to that. The diagnosis now is made by, it's what's called a clinical diagnosis, which means we make the diagnosis on the basis of the history as presented by the individual and his or her family obviously being very, very important in this disease. And on doing certain tests, biological tests, blood tests, X-ray, CAT scan, MRI type tests, mostly to rule out other conditions, not so much to rule in Alzheimer's. Though, as I say, we're getting close to that, and there is a type of PET scan that is now available on a research basis and clinically sort of, but not paid for by insurance, where you can get an injection of a radioisotope that will label amyloid in your brain, and then if you have it, it'll light up like a street light in the PET scan, and will say you've got amyloid. It doesn't say you've got Alzheimer's, it says you've got amyloid, and which is highly associated with Alzheimer's, but we still don't know whether that's cause and effect. So the short answer to your question is no, we still don't have that. We're getting closer. Clinicians who are experienced in this area can be accurate in making a diagnosis about 90% of the time. So that's not bad, but obviously we'd like to be able to be 100% accurate, and we'd especially like to be able to, although let me elaborate on this, we'd especially like to be able to say, in 5 years, you're going to have Alzheimer's. Now let's do A, B, and C to prevent that. Right now, A, B, and C don't exist. We don't have anything to do to prevent that. And so, in a way, I don't want us to reach the ability to make that prediction before we have something we can do about it, because we're going to have a lot of suicides on our hands if we do. It's an interesting and worrisome ethical issue. If I told you, or somebody told me, you definitely are going to have Alzheimer's in such and such a year, And okay, what do we do about it? There's nothing we can do about it, sorry. I don't know what I'd do with that information. I don't like it, so.
So this population that we call it the preclinical population that has what appears to be some of the pathology of Alzheimer's disease without any cognitive symptoms is the population in Alzheimer's research that they're very, very interested in, and because they feel that we're going to need to intervene on that level, but before there are symptoms. And there is a very large study in Boston being done at Brigham and Women's in Harvard, very large, that has a large number of people in this study have they do that PET scan Bob talked about, and they're cognitively normal. So they have beta amyloid in their brains, and they're testing different drugs, and then they also have some people in the study that are starting to show symptoms. And there is a small branch of that study that's dealing with just what you were talking about, that's that people that are cognitively normal can elect confidentiality, which means that they can elect not to know whether they have the beta amyloid in their brains. And the ones that elect to know, they have a small study where they're working with them psychologically to see the psychological impact of that and what types of support they need, that people would need to work through that and to be able to live with that. So that we're doing that, yes.
Is there still a large impending, perhaps more statistical than otherwise, impending crisis due to population and aging and everything that we are still looking at 10, 20 plus years into the future?
Very much so.
Yeah.
And
The reason, the numbers of people with Alzheimer's is ballooning. And the reason for that is not because it's, the disease is catching and you're getting it from the guy down the street. It's simply because we're all getting older. And the population is getting older. The world population is getting older. This is not just a New Hampshire or a U.S. problem. This is a worldwide problem. The older you are, the greater chance you have of getting this disease. If you're 65, you have about a 2 to 4% chance of having Alzheimer's. If you're 90, you have about a 50% chance of having it. So the statistics goes up and up every 5 years. It doubles the incidence of the disease. So the greatest risk factor by far is age. And as those of us who are baby boomers are reaching our age of risk, I'm in my late 60s, and I tried to lie there, it didn't work. I'm 67, yeah, I'll put it that way. And so I'm a baby boomer, and there are many of us who are in this group. We've been followed by society ever since the war. How many of us were born post-war babies? And as our group reaches into our 60s and late 60s and into the age where Alzheimer's really takes off in frequency, there's a great concern that if we don't find a cure or prevention, I don't think there's ever going to be a cure. I think prevention is the answer. That we're going to be faced with an insurmountable problem. Right now, there are 5.4 million people in the United States with Alzheimer's disease. Here in Vermont, about 15,000, 12,000, something like that, tiny little Vermont. But in the United States, it's estimated that if we don't have a cure for this disease by the middle of this century, we're not going to have 5 million people with Alzheimer's. We're going to have about 14 million people with Alzheimer's. How are we going to care for those? How are we going to pay for them? This is one of the most expensive diseases that there is for the individual family and for society, for states, for Medicaid, which Alzheimer's is the biggest single cost to Medicaid in every state. So this disease is going to break the bank if we don't find a cure soon. Now, I'm not saying by 2050 we won't have a cure, but I don't know that we will. We haven't had a new medication released for this disease for 11 years. 11 years. The last new medication that came on the market was memantine, Namenda. It came on the market in 2004, January 2004. And That's the most recent medicine that we have that's been released that's been approved by the FDA. In fact, it's been around so long that the company's about to lose its patent. I don't know if you've been reading about this. Our lovely friends in the pharmaceutical industry make a fortune now on Namenda, but they're seeing their dollars dry up as the drug is about to go generic, meaning that other companies will be able to produce it, and within 6 months the price will go from several $100s a month to $10 a month, like Aricept has. And so what the company did was they came out with it's a twice-a-day medication currently. They came out with a once-a-day version and announced that they were going to discontinue the twice-a-day version before the generic became available, so that everybody would be forced to switch to the once-a-day version, which, by the way, will have a patent for another 15 years. Thankfully, New York State sued them and won. It was just announced in the paper the other day. They are not allowed to give up this the twice-a-day drug until 1 month after the generics are on the market. Then they can give it up, and at which point they'll be happy to give it up. And it was an important victory for the Alzheimer's community. There was a figure in the paper the other day, I don't remember what the number was, but if they had won this suit, if the company had won the suit, the cost to Medicare and to Medicaid would have been, they gave the numbers, I don't remember what they are, they're just vast, astronomical, because of the cost of these brand name drugs compared to generics. And this was a move they tried to make cynically for their stockholders on the backs of their patients, and they should be ashamed of themselves. And I'm so glad they lost this suit. So,
who gave you permission to retire?
well, why not?
One more question and then we need to stop.
Okay.
Chris, go ahead.
Oh, well, regarding those medicines, particularly those two, what does the research show, and what are your thoughts as practitioners about how effective they are? Are they oversubscribed?
Just giving anecdotal from my experience. So, with the families that I've worked with over the years, just anecdotally, probably about a third of them, with the cholinesterase inhibitors, feel that early enough, if the person gets it early enough in the disease, that they see some difference for a while, year, not more than 2 years. The majority of families that I work with just don't see anything. It's not better or worse. I have worked with several families that they had that situation where the person was on a cholinesterase inhibitor. It's like they didn't make any noticeable difference, but they could tolerate it, so they just stayed on it. And then they had some other type of health or medical crises, went into the hospital, stopped their cholinesterase inhibitor rather suddenly, and had a sudden drop in cognition. So it was doing something for them, and there's probably other factors that led to the cognitive drop. So, and then there's a small percentage of families that the person can't tolerate them and don't take them. So that's my experience.
Yeah, and I think that matches mine. And the simple fact that it's so hard to tell whether the drug is doing anything says if it's doing something, it's not doing much. You want a medicine that says, boy, I'm never going to stop this. Look at this, how well is it? And unfortunately, that is not the case with these medications. And this whole business with Namenda, when they tried this ploy, made many people try to stop it with her because they were just so angry about it and didn't want to have to face these increased costs over the years. But I think, yes, and I practiced this field long enough so that the first medicines we had came in the late 90s for Alzheimer's, and I was doing this before we had any medicines. We just simply watched people get worse. I'm glad we have medicines. They're better than nothing, but they're a whole lot better than nothing. And that's a sad state of affairs. So I hate to end on such a sour note, but I think we're supposed to stop now, so we'll do that. Thank you very, very much for being here.